Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. Emmett Till's death, 1955. Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott, 1955. The Little Rock Nine, 1957. The Greensboro sit-ins, 1961. The Birmingham riots, 1963. How was the federal government going to respond to all the demands for civil rights by African Americans? Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. Emmett Till, 1955. Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott, 1955. The Little Rock Nine, 1957. Greensboro sit-ins, 1961. The Birmingham riots, 1963. The time had come for the federal government to respond and pass civil rights legislation on a national level. Senator from Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy, had voted for civil rights measures but never actively pushed the issue. During his presidential campaign, however, Kennedy had sought and won many African American votes with bold rhetoric. In 1960, he proclaimed, "If the president does not himself wage the struggle for equal rights, if he stands above the battle, then the battle will inevitably be lost." However, once he was elected, Kennedy moved very slowly on civil rights issues. He did not want to anger Southern Democratic senators whose votes he needed on other issues. He did appoint some African Americans to prominent positions within his administration. However, he also appointed segregationists to the federal court. As the civil rights movement gained momentum and violence began to spread, Kennedy could no longer avoid the issue. Earlier in his term, Kennedy had proposed a modest civil rights bill. After the crisis in Birmingham in 1963, he introduced a far stronger one. The bill would prohibit segregation in public places, ban discrimination wherever federal funding was involved, and advance school desegregation. Powerful Southern segregationists in Congress, however, kept the bill from coming up for a vote. To focus national attention on Kennedy's bill, civil rights leaders proposed a march on Washington. The march took place in August 1963. More than 200,000 people came from all over the country to call for jobs and freedom. 3 months after the March on Washington, President Kennedy was assassinated, and the Civil Rights Bill was not much closer to passage. The new president, Lyndon Johnson, was finally able to move the legislation on. Johnson let Congress know that he would accept no compromise on civil rights. After the House of Representatives passed the bill, civil rights opponents in the Senate started a lengthy filibuster, exercising their right of unlimited day and night debate. Johnson finally enlisted his former colleague, Republican Minority Leader Everett Dirksen, to support the rarely used procedure called cloture, a 3/5 vote to limit debate and call for a vote. In June 1964, the Senate voted for cloture, which successfully ended the filibuster. Soon after, the bill passed with support from both Democrats and Republicans. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 had an impact on many areas, including voting, schools, and jobs. The law's major sections included these provisions. It banned the use of different voter registration standards for blacks and whites. It prohibited discrimination in public accommodations such as motels, restaurants, gas, theaters, and sports arenas. It allowed the withholding of federal funds from public or private programs that practice discrimination. And it banned discrimination on the basis of race, sex, religion, or national origin by employers and unions. And it also created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to investigate charges of job discrimination. Even with a strong new law like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, change came slowly, and civil rights leaders pushed harder for expanded rights, most notably voting rights. Another legal landmark was the 24th Amendment to the Constitution, which was also ratified in 1964. This amendment outlawed the poll tax, which was still being used in several southern states like Virginia, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, and Texas, in order to keep poor African Americans from voting. Many black Southerners still had trouble obtaining their voting rights. In Selma, Alabama, police and sheriff's deputies arrested people just for standing in line to register to vote. To call attention to the voting rights issue, King and other leaders decided to organize a protest march. They would walk from Selma to the state capital, Montgomery, about 50 miles away. As the marchers set out on Sunday morning in March of 1965, armed state troopers on horseback charged into the crowd with whips, clubs, and tear gas. TV pictures of the attack again shocked many viewers. In response, President Johnson put the Alabama National Guard under federal control. He sent members of the National Guard along with federal marshals and Army helicopters to protect the march route. When the Selma marchers started out again, supporters from all over the country flocked to join them. By the time the march reached Montgomery, there were over 25,000 marchers. Reacting to Selma, Johnson went on national television promising a new law to protect voting rights. Raising his arms, Johnson repeated, "And we shall overcome." That summer, despite another filibuster, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Under the act, federal officials could register voters in places where local officials were blocking registration by African Americans. The act also effectively eliminated literacy tests and other barriers used to keep African Americans from voting. In a year after the law passed, more than 400,000 African Americans had been registered to vote in the Deep South. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 discriminated concerning the sale, rental, and financing of housing based on race, religion, national origin, or sex. Intended as a follow-up to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the bill was the subject of a contentious debate in the Senate, but was passed quickly by the House of Representatives in days after the assassination of civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. The Fair Housing Act stands as the final great legislative achievement of the Civil Rights era. Despite Supreme Court decisions such as Shelley v. Kramer (1948) and Jones v. Meyer Company (1968), which outlawed the exclusion of African Americans or other minorities from certain sections of cities, race-based housing patterns were still enforced by the late 1960s. Those who challenged them often met with resistance, hostility, and even violence. Despite the historic nature of the Fair Housing Act and its stature as the last major act of legislation of the civil rights movement, in practice, housing remained segregated in many areas of the United States in the years that followed. From 1950 to 1980, the total black population in America's urban centers increased from 6.1 million to 15.3 million. During the same time period, white Americans steadily moved out of the cities into the suburbs, taking many of the employment opportunities blacks needed into communities where they were not welcome to live. This trend led to the growth in urban America of ghettos or inner city communities with high minority populations that were plagued by unemployment, crime, and social evil. In 1988, Congress passed the Fair Housing Amendments Act, which expanded the law to prohibit discrimination in housing based on disability or family status, pregnant women, or the presence of children under the age of 18. Affirmative action was initiated by the administration of President Lyndon Johnson in order to improve opportunities for African Americans while civil rights legislation was dismantling the legal basis for discrimination. In other words, it was designed to help African Americans to catch up after years of being discriminated in hiring practices and admissions on college campuses. The federal government began to institute affirmative action policies under the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964 and an executive order passed by Johnson or issued by Johnson in 1965. Businesses receiving federal funds were prohibited from using aptitude tests and other criteria that tended to discriminate against African Americans. Subsequently, affirmative action was broadened to cover women, Native Americans, Hispanics, and other minorities, and was extended to colleges and universities and federal and state agencies. By the late 1970s, the use of racial quotas and minority set-asides led to court challenges of affirmative action as a form of reverse discrimination. The first major challenge was the Regents of the University of California versus Bach in 1978. In this case, Alan Bach was a highly qualified graduate who applied to the University of California Medical School twice and was denied. although he also applied to 15 other medical schools and was denied entrance into them as well. Bach sued the University of California Medical School because they had set aside specific slots for minorities to increase minority presence due to affirmative action. The university had established a rule that for every 100 slots in a medical school, 16 of those slots would go to minority candidates or to women. Although Bach did not have high scores in comparison to the other white male candidates, he did have better scores than several of the minority candidates, and as a result, he sued the school because he felt he was being discriminated upon due to his race. Bach's argument was based upon the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, and that says that the laws must be applied to all people equally. In this case, Bach deserved to have the same opportunity to get into the medical school as all candidates, even the minority candidates. And because the minority candidates were being given 16 slots out of the 100, and the school was accepting lower test scores for minority candidates, Bach was being discriminated against, and the law was not being applied to him equally, hence the violation of his 14th Amendment rights. In this decision, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that quotas may not be used to reserve places for minority applicants if white applicants are denied a chance to compete for those places. Although the court outlawed quota programs, it allowed colleges to use race as a factor in making college admissions decisions if all other factors were equal. As a result, affirmative action survived and continues to provide opportunities for minorities and women in jobs, hiring practices, and college admission procedures to this day. Despite a slow start to the African American civil rights movement in the 1950s, the 1960s saw several major advances for the African American civil rights movement. The most notable was the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was the most comprehensive civil rights law passed by the federal government up to that time. The resulting acts of the Voting Rights Act, the 24th Amendment, which outlawed the poll tax, the Fair Housing Act of 1968, and affirmative action, which really began in 1965, were all designed to support the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and build upon the protections of rights that were afforded to African Americans, other minorities, and women as a result of the Civil Rights Act of 1964.